Welcome along. It's another edition of the Punt here on the 42. We are here, as we are every month, in association with William Hill. So please do gamble responsibly and visit dunleary.net. So the focus of this week's show and this month's show is a weekend in Manchester. We'll be talking about Manchester United against Liverpool with David Sneyd in a few moments. But first of all, we're looking ahead to Natasha Jonas and Katie Taylor renewing rivalries in the Manchester Arena, this time in the professional ranks and 9 years on from their famous meeting in the London 2012 Olympics. Joining me to look ahead to that fight are Gavin Casey of The42 and Joe O'Neill of IrishBoxing.com. Gav, let's start with you. You might tell us briefly what's at stake for Katie on Saturday night and whether we can expect another Olympic-style classic between her and Jonas.
The usual, I suppose, is at stake, Gav. All of the marbles, as they say, all of the belts at £135, an undefeated record and an undisputed status, if you like. It's been the case over her last couple of fights. She obviously did move up briefly to challenge Christina Linarda too for a £140 title as well, which she won, which she since relinquished. And that wouldn't be on the line, generally speaking, anyway, in a lightweight fight. As for your second question, can we expect another classic akin to their Olympic clash? I think so. I think there is always a case to be made for Katie coming down a level to her opponents at times in order to entertain. I'm not saying that she's leagues above Natasha Jonas at all. Natasha Jonas is a fantastic fighter and maybe the best pure boxer that Katie has faced, but I do think Katie is a better fighter, and yet if the invitation is there for a tear-up, even without fans present, Katie usually accepts it. So I'd anticipate it being a very entertaining fight. I think that Jonas also has the capacity to entertain. Like, when you go back to that 2012 fight, it's kind of how I expected to play out this weekend in a different guise, in that it was an amateur point scoring system at that time, and it was always a fun fight throughout the 4 rounds, but there was really always a sense that Katie was in marginal control of it and always had her nose ahead. And I sort of see it playing out similarly this weekend.
Joe, you might tell us what Jonas has been up to since she last crossed our consciousness 9 years ago.
She's had a winding sort of journey. She basically retired from boxing. She had a child, and then Taylor turns pro in 2016, and Jonas is on commentary and analysis for the fight, and she's talking about how she won't be coming back, and Taylor's joking with her, saying, "Oh, come on," and then a couple of years later, Jonas has turned pro herself, and it seemed like, because she's a bit of a Sky Sports darling, like it was a big fight that they were going to build immediately. Jonas starts well, gets a couple of wins under her belt, but then it all goes seemingly down the toilet when she loses to Vivian Obanoff, who Taylor beat in her second fight. She got stopped pretty definitively in that fight, and it looked sort of that she was just going to drift off, not come back. And then she comes back, gets a few wins under her belt, but again, not in the same sort of conversation as Taylor. We're not really seeing it at all. And she ends up fighting last summer Terry Harper, who was a world champion the weight below Taylor, super featherweight. She wasn't given a chance in that fight really at all. It was seen sort of as a passing of the guard. Terry Harper is one of these new breeds. I think she's 22, 23, whereas Jonas is in her mid-30s. And it was sort of seen as this was an opportunity for Harper to look really good and to get a win over a known name. But what happened was really anything but that. Jonas basically showed all her skills and nous to really, well, I wouldn't say give a lesson to Harper, because it was a really close fight, but she really surprised everyone there, Jonas, and the fight ended up a draw as itself. I'd say a strong majority of people probably thought Jonas deserved a nod. At least I did. I had her winning by 2 points. I think, Gavin, you'd be similar.
Yeah.
Then yeah, so they were talking maybe there'll be a rematch that fight, but again, nothing came of it. And Taylor now in need of an opponent, or at least in need of a known opponent on this side of the Atlantic. Jonas sort of really just fit the bill there, and this really long winding saga is finally getting its second installment, or third, I suppose. They met twice in the amateurs.
Just to go back to the Obanov defeat, Gav, at that time, as Joe said, it felt like it had derailed Jonas's entire professional career, which was probably, if we're honest, born of a desire to fight Katie Taylor. I mean, as Joe was saying, when she was ringside for Taylor's debut, she jokingly or half-jokingly laughed off suggestions that she might turn pro herself. And I think only after seeing Taylor's progress over the next couple of years, the money she was beginning to make, the adulation she was beginning to receive, probably especially in the UK, where Jonas should have been the darling, really, inspired her to turn professional. I don't think she ever looked at it as a kind of a long haul thing or a long term goal. It was more so something where she probably sought immediate gratification because she had the kind of not even raw materials, but the ingredients from her amateur career, the ability to go a long way in the pro sport. And that Obanov defeat was kind of it's a little chapter in the story of just their professional rivalry, if you like, because Brian Peters, Katie Taylor's manager, would be fairly friendly with Joe Gallagher, who's Natasha Jonas's trainer. And I know Peters was trying his best to be persuasive and insistent that Jonas doesn't campaign down at super featherweight, where he felt she'd be a little bit more vulnerable. There are a couple of big punchers down there, a couple of dangerous fighters, some of whom she never even wound up facing because of that defeat to Obanov. And Peters maintained that this was a massive fight, perspective fight between Taylor and Jonas. Think of it on Sky Sports, where, as Joe says, Jonas is a name, Taylor is now a massive name. And the fact that Obanov stopped her and seemingly put an end to all of it was the source of much ire on the behalf of Taylor's team. Not so much Taylor herself. She doesn't really think of these things in these terms. It doesn't really care who she fights, really. But for Jonas then to launch a career comeback, if you like, that culminates in this title shot against Terry Harper, who, if Obanov stopped Jonas, Harper would have been expected to do similar eventually. She hits relatively hard, like punches with a bit of a thud at least. And she had been on a kind of a meteoric rise of her own, like stacking up wins, but also accruing fans and selling tickets when that was a possibility not long ago. And Jonas did ostensibly beat her. It's a complete career renaissance, if you like. And you could argue maybe to go from that directly into a title shot a division above is a bit of a leap in a couple of ways, in that maybe she should have had to win a fight at 135 pounds or something in the interim, but she did ostensibly beat a champion at 130, and the fight is back on and as big as it would have been had she never lost to Obanov, which is quite remarkable. And that really does come back down to that performance against Harper. It was a fight that should have been lost, and for all intents and purposes was lost, but has been rediscovered and is the co-main event now on a Sky Sports box office show on prime time on a Saturday night.
But we talk so often about Katie Taylor being transformative for women's boxing. I, perhaps lazily, always assumed that she would be transformative for the generations to come after her. But it sounds with Natasha Jonas, she's effectively helped give Jonas a professional career. So she's making waves and making possibilities for her contemporaries herself, which is kind of an interesting angle to the ripple effect to Katie's career that I hadn't really considered up to now. So on Jonas, Joe, I mean, to what extent was the Terry Harper performance an aberration, or to what extent can we look at it and say she might trouble Katie Taylor on Saturday night?
This is maybe where I'm going to contradict myself, but I do sort of believe that the Jonas Harper fight was not a one-off performance from Jonas, but a sort of a career best, almost like a last standy sort of performance. I don't think she'll be able to replicate that, especially against someone like Katie Taylor. Like, say, if Harper and Jonas were to rematch next month, I'd probably be picking Harper again. But she, like, I don't want to disrespect Jonas because, again, she's a brilliant boxer. She's won, I know people always say Taylor won 18 major gold medals. I think Jonas won around 6 medals herself. Like, she is very, very technically proficient, but they're not really the sort of people that will trouble Taylor in the pros. like as Gavin said just there, that she probably is the technically best fighter Taylor has fought in the pros, but it's probably the least technically proficient fighters that have caused Taylor problems. The likes of Pursoon, McCaskill, and Linnadartu, just the rough and tough brawlers, unorthodox sort of people that Taylor wouldn't have really come across in her 10 years at the very top level of the amateur game, whereas Jonas is a lot purer than that, and that I think is just going to play into Taylor's hands. Like I really don't see a way that Jonas can win this fight. Like she does, like if you're going through all her attributes, she probably does have more power than Taylor, and that southpaw straight left hand right hook, it worked well against someone a bit greener like Harper, but it's not like I don't really believe anyone in women's boxing has that sort of one punch knockout power. If anyone was going to, it probably will be someone like Jonas, but I don't think that's going to be enough to win a 10-round fight with Taylor.
Can I just jump in there, Gavin? And while I broadly agree, I do think it's worth considering that even though Joe is absolutely spot on in saying that the more come forward, abrasive types of fighters have troubled Taylor more than purer boxers. Like this fight does remind me in some ways of Taylor's fight with David Wallstrom, who was also an amateur rival of hers from that sort of Taylor Jonas era, if you like. And Wallstrom performed very capably. Taylor kind of beat the brakes off her in the end and won a lopsided decision. I think in a fight in which the rounds are only 2 minutes long, game plans, which are such an annoying buzzword really across a lot of sports, are absolutely quintessential to the outcome of a fight. And if Jonas has worked on something, some kind of a wrinkle, particularly from a southpaw stance, that she can drop 3-4 times, even 2-3 times in a round, it can be enough at times in a quiet sort of a fight to win rounds. And I anticipate Jonas will win a few rounds here. And like when there are only 10 of them and when they're only 2 minutes long, you can dig yourself a hole fairly quickly, or you can steal a little bit of a lead fairly quickly. I don't think it's inconceivable that, say, the shots that Joe mentions there, like I don't anticipate Jonas is going to land her left hook, right hand as readily as against Taylor as she was able to against Harper, who was much greener. Not only is Taylor just a better fundamental boxer than Harper, but also she'll have seen footage of Jonas doing that, and with years of experience, she won't need Ross Enamai telling her how to avoid it. I mean, she'll know. But if Jonas can, I guess, conceive of something else, some other little combination that maybe Taylor hasn't faced as a pro so far. She's only fought one other southpaw. Win a few rounds, who knows? Like, it is, everything is stacked in Taylor's favour, don't get me wrong, and Joe is correct in what he says, but I don't think people should be going into this fight expecting a guaranteed Taylor victory. I know it's a bit of a cliche, nothing is guaranteed in boxing, but I really only mean nothing is guaranteed in this specific fight. Jonas has enough in her arsenal to make it a difficult night, even if we don't necessarily anticipate that she will.
To what extent is Katie vulnerable, Gav? Because every time we preview a Taylor fight now, or the last few anyway, those Pursoon fights do a lot of heavy lifting because, the theory is, well, it shows that the Taylor can be hurt and she's human like the rest of us, and that was the main kind of discourse ahead of the Gutierrez fight. And then Taylor was outrageously good and barely had a scratch on her and barely had sweat on her brow by the time the fight was over. Like, is she vulnerable at all, or is that angle, because I know Natasha Jonas has been playing up that angle ahead of this fight as well, and Sky have been going along with it to say that she is vulnerable, she is human. So is she, or can Jonas exploit that?
I think everybody is vulnerable if they get punched squarely in the chin to some degree, and to varying degrees. Like, Taylor has a brilliant chin, and we've known that for years. And we've seen her hit really hard by Delphine Pursoon and hit often by Delphine Pursoon, particularly in the first fight, but also to a degree in the second fight. And we've seen her rattled, hurt. I would say if there was an extra minute at the end of the 10th round in their original fight at MSG, Taylor was in danger of being stopped. That was my impression being there. And that was my impression watching it back. She probably disagrees. I know a lot of more people who would agree. So if Jonas, with the power that Joe was talking about, is able to land cleanly and land often, she conceivably wins the fight. The reality or the expectation is that she won't be able to do that because Taylor is so good. But Pursoon showed that there is a way, in that it's to absolutely barrage her with come forward pressure, back her into corners, put her on the back foot for the entirety of the fight. And Taylor can box off the back foot pretty well, but Pursoon is almost superhuman in her own way, in that there are probably questions around it, to be totally honest, but in that she is able to outlast a fully professional fighter as a policewoman, and probably looks like she has another 9-10 rounds in her at the end of fights. Jonas can exert a different type of pressure, but she can't do that. And that's the way to beat Taylor, probably, or at least that's the only way we know somebody can beat Taylor at the moment as a professional. Jonas might have other ideas as to how that can be done, and we'll find out on Saturday night. But like, to answer your question about Taylor's vulnerability or her fallibility, of course she's only human, we know that, but you have to make her look human. And really, is it fair to say, Joe, only one person in Pursoon has done that? I know you mentioned McCaskill. You could argue McCaskill made her look human, but it was still I would say a fairly conclusive victory for Taylor. Same with Leonardo too. You're looking at like a 7-3 type of victory in rounds. So Pursoon is the only one who has, Pursoon has, as Jonas said, completely eroded that aura of invincibility that Taylor has. And we saw that towards the end of her amateur career as well, with a couple of defeats where it was suddenly like the bubble popped and she was less this mythical figure and more a boxer who can be beaten. But it's all well and good saying that in advance of the fight, but Natasha Jonas isn't Delphine Pursoon, so she has to find a way to show that Taylor is human and go that one step further, I think.
And it sounds like, Joe, that maybe Jonas doesn't have quite the style to do that.
No, I don't think she has the style, and even her own durability, she did look very, very strong against Harper, as we were saying, but that was the only time that she's ever gone 10 rounds as a pro. And I know they're only 2-minute rounds, but it is still a box to be ticked. And Taylor has gone, I think, 9 times she's gone the distance. Like, Taylor has shown herself to be extremely durable. Her chin, as Gavin has said, is insane. And yeah, like, if you're looking at this from a non-Irish standpoint, you're like, we always sort of have a tendency to like see where Taylor is fallible, but like, Taylor is the one here who was perhaps more rugged, more durable, and it's Jonas you'd be looking at, like, can she last 10 rounds with Taylor and Taylor's body attack, which is so good? Will she wilt down the stretch? Will Jonas maybe look to try make it a boxing match and let Taylor build up a head of steam sort of and take over the fight? And then are you into a sort of scenario like the Gutierrez fight, where after only a few rounds you're wondering, like, the only real question is whether Taylor will get stoppage or not?
The Gutierrez fight, Gav, is an interesting one, in that quite a lot of the discourse after that was that Miriam Gutierrez had no business being in the ring with Katie Taylor. Women's boxing was a joke again, even though we'd literally just seen Taylor in 2 epic fights with Pursoon. But whatever, it's uncompetitive, nobody can touch her. And the reality is that Gutierrez is actually a good boxer. Like, she won a couple of Spanish titles at 2 different weight divisions as an amateur. She's been boxing for 2 decades competitively. This wasn't some woman coming in from behind the counter with Burger King. Like, this was an actual boxer who Taylor utterly diffused, dismantled, and ultimately destroyed. And that is I guess bolsters Joe's point about how Taylor does well against boxers. Like, Gutierrez, as much as she didn't really get an opportunity to show it, she can box, she can punch as well. Savannah Marshall, who's a world champion 25 pounds above the women we're talking about now, has sparred with Gutierrez and said she can really punch in advance of the fight. She said this should be a good fight between Taylor and Gutierrez. So that's sometimes the danger. If you don't have that come forward kind of pressure style, or if you can't take the heat in the kitchen for 10 rounds, you could be systematically picked apart. And Jonas needs to exert pressure cleverly here. Like, she probably does need to be the aggressor in the fight, but as Joe says, then can she do that for 10 rounds against somebody who's probably going to be hitting her relentlessly, accurately, sharply? Like, Taylor's not the most powerful puncher in the world, but she punches hard enough to really annoy you. Kind of that Mayweather type power, late stage Mayweather type power. And there's no evidence to suggest really that Jonas can do that because we haven't seen her against a boxer of Taylor's ilk. And the 2 times she's come under proper fire have been Obenauf, she crumbled. Harper, she did extremely well. And this is a step up, a massive step up from both of those.
Just briefly, Gav, like the Jonas fight is one of the most memorable moments of Katie's amateur career. Like I would say that the gold medal fight in London, and then sadly the defeat to Pat Conan in Rio. Like I can't actually really remember the semi-final in London, but I do very vividly remember the Jonas quarter-final because it was just such a great occasion and it was a good fight. So there will be people tuning into this fight on Saturday night who haven't seen Taylor a whole lot since that fight against Jonas in 2012. So could you briefly tell us how she has changed, how Taylor has changed, or if she has changed at all in how she fights in those intervening 9 years in the step from amateur to professional?
She has changed. They're probably more subtle changes. Like she's definitely added a few shots to her arsenal under Rossini that she's needed to keep people off of her, I suppose, in the pro game where that come forward style is rewarded more. Whereas when she was an amateur, she was fighting under a completely different point scoring system than exists now. The scoring system in the amateur game now is pretty much the same as the pros. When Taylor was an amateur, it was about it was really accuracy that was rewarded rather than pressure. So she's always had check hooks and things like that. In fact, it's difficult to say, oh, she didn't have this shot before, because Joe's the man with the stats in terms of her amateur career. He inputs them on boxrec.com, which is the official record of these things. But in however many amateur fights Taylor had in total, she's probably thrown every shot in the book, right? It's more about perfecting some of those skills and being able to combine them with other skills that I think she's added to her arsenal since. And even some of her counter-punching in that second Pursoon fight was exquisite. I mean, some of the most pure, beautiful boxing you could actually see. And these were little maneuvers that she was producing that she wasn't able to do against Pursoon the first time. So whatever about her, the differences in her now compared to when she fought Jonas for the first time, she's actually probably shown that she's added a few things in between fights at times as a professional, which is a testament to her work with Rossini. I think one thing that I noticed when I look back on her amateur career or some of her old amateur fights is that she is slower now than she was then. It's not something that's discussed at all, but of course at her age, as she approaches her, or she's in her mid-30s, I guess, she's bound to be a little bit slower. She's fought for the majority of her life, and these things do take a toll on your reflexes, your athleticism. It might not be especially perceptible unless you've watched a lot of her, but she has slowed down a bit, which makes it to me a little bit more impressive that she remains this supreme boxer in the professional ranks who for a long time did have that aura of invincibility. And I'm not saying she's at the cliff's edge where she should be considering retirement, because she hasn't slowed down to that degree whatsoever. In many ways, you could say she's a more complete fighter now than she was then. She's just that little bit less athletic, tiny bit less athletic than she used to be, and has had to probably adapt a little bit to that. That being said, nobody really comes close to her in those departments either still, so maybe it's just a case that we haven't really seen that cause her too much hassle yet. But in terms of, I suppose, to go back to your original question, like how she's different, or will people notice her being different this time around? I guess if you haven't watched her since 2012, or if you've only watched her a couple of times in the last 9 years, probably not that different. But to people who follow boxing, the likes of Joe, probably considerably different, to be fair, as is Jonas. She stressed yesterday that there's not a great deal you can read into their first fight in order to predict a winner here, in that they're two different people, two different fighters, they fight a different way, and they're fighting in a different sport, really. So as much as it could resemble the first fight in the sense that it should be entertaining, they're two different animals in there at the moment. Not to say that they're far better now than they were then, but they are different, to answer your question.
Joe, if Katie does win on Saturday, which I think we all are expecting, what's next? Does she have any worlds left to conquer?
See, this is actually, I find, a really interesting question, because there is really sort of two paths for her. There is there's America, which seems to be probably where she will be heading, and you have the likes of Jessica McCaskill, who is undisputed champion at welterweight now, a rematch there. there's always going to be the Amanda Serrano saga that's going on. But I think after the Gutierrez fight, there's her handlers at Matchroom really sort of want fights that at least appear meaningful, and that's why Jonas is filling such a gap here, because Gutierrez, like Gav alluded to it there, didn't really get a great reception from some people, sort of like, who basically just wrote off all of Gutierrez's talents, and it was Taylor, and it was bad for women's boxing according to some people. But like, I think there are people like on this side, like Estelle Mosley, who won Olympic gold in 2016. That is a potential fight, but maybe not a super fight like the McCaskill or Serrano fights would be in America, where Taylor probably will be rounding out her career. But it's whether she can get those Serrano and McCaskill fights next, which I'm not 100% sure on. I'd be confident enough that they could get the McCaskill. Maybe they'd want to build it a bit more, but you do have people like Mosley or even Ochagava, who Taylor fought in the Olympic final. She's turned pro now. She turned pro, got a couple of wins, took a few years off, and then came back last December. That would be a fight with plenty of sort of narrative and juice in it. And I'm just wondering like how Taylor does get to that McCaskill and Serrano fights, because they are the two sort of, not cash out fights, but they're the two biggest fights on the table at the minute. Like, Taylor rightly has written off the chance of a sort of freak showy sort of fight with Clarissa Shields, who is too high up in weight for Taylor to even really consider. But yeah, so to really just condense everything there. Yes, I think it's going to be McCaskill and Serrano eventually. Whether they're next or whether they'll try find a few more Jonas-esque sort of opponents remains to be seen.
Just taking a brief look at this card elsewhere. Gav, tell us about James Tennyson.
Yeah, he has a fight for the IBO world title, which has been the source of a lot of discussion, including with Tennyson himself yesterday on a presser. It's not one of the governing bodies that would typically be recognised as a major governing body, or its belts wouldn't be recognised as major belts necessarily, but Tennyson is counting it as a world title fight and feels that this is an opportunity for which his hard work has paid off. And to anyone who is unfamiliar with Tennyson at this point, first and foremost, I would say watch him on Saturday night. He's a young lad from Belfast who packs a bit of a wallop. He's always in fun fights. He's on the fringes, I would say, of world title contention for the 4 more recognised belts. There are some massive names in America that are currently the custodians of those belts, and Saturday night for Tennyson is about winning explosively. And Joe, like to bring you in here, Joe, it's a conversation we've had in the past. It's also about riding on Katie Taylor's coattails a little bit, and that sounds quite disrespectful to Tennyson, so I'll try and qualify it. What I mean is, to a lot of people watching this or listening to this at the moment, they might not be necessarily aware of who Tennyson is, but first and foremost, he's so entertaining that he should have kind of a pull with fans or with casual sports fans, because he's a knockout artist, like, and people tend to like that, even if they're not massive followers of boxing or say MMA. But secondly, with the fact that Carl Frampton has stepped away from the sport quite recently, there is a void in Belfast now, and probably a void in Irish boxing generally, alongside Katie Taylor, to become the male equivalent or the male star in the sport here. And Tennyson has the ability and the style, I think, to fill that void, but it's about taking it. And on Saturday he gets the opportunity to put himself in the living rooms of people all over the island, not just in Belfast, and put his hand up, look good, and people hopefully will continue to follow him. He doesn't say an enormous amount, and I mentioned this at a presser yesterday, and I think his trainer Tony Dunlop took issue with it at the end. I'm not sure if he was speaking about me, but he was kind of making the point that, like, just because he doesn't say much doesn't mean anything. He's a down-to-earth, humble guy. Anybody who ever interviews him says that to me, which I'd agree with. He's an absolutely lovely man. It's just that he likes to let his fists do the talking. I'd suggest that sometimes, even though you have that as a career avenue, if you like, it's no harm to do a little bit of talking of your own as well and add that into the mix and really try to grab attention, because he has the potential to be a massive star. And Saturday is kind of another step towards realising that. But Joe, I know your colleague Johnny Stapleton kind of disagrees. He likes the idea of Tennyson being a quiet assassin and being this almost mysterious figure who doesn't say a great deal in advance of fights and then goes in and bombs opponents out, which is nice as well. It's just, for my own opinion, with opportunities like Saturday where you have a huge Irish audience, hopefully, it wouldn't be any harm for him to open up that little bit more, just give people a sample of his personality as well as his ability.
Yeah, like it is between yourself and Johnny's points, it is a bit of a tightrope, but like, as you're saying, you can get that sort of warm Belfast humour with, like, he is he's not a plank. Like he does have a personality, and it's almost like, it's not like he's camera shy or anything, but he just doesn't seem really interested by it and bored a bit by self-promotion. Like, it doesn't really appeal to everyone, and maybe because previously, like someone say like Carl Frampton or Mick Conlon, they had the cameras and the attention from the very start, so like you're able to see the personality shine through in a more gradual sense, whereas James Tennyson came up the hard way, did it the right way, but to then be in front of the cameras and then been doing the interviews, it maybe is hard to sort of portray something that seems genuine. I think this week actually has been quite good though, because like you've seen, like I've seen a bit more personality from James in his talking heads with Sky and stuff like that. Like he's joking about Johnny Nelson, who infamously for boxing fans said that James Tennyson could knock out Gervonta Davis next, which was a bit ambitious, but Tennyson has said like, oh, it just made me laugh, and like he was joking about it, called Johnny Nelson the founder of the James Tennyson fan club or something. But like just little bits like that, which is more than we've gotten previously, and more like the sort of real Tennyson that you'd know from the bowels of small hall shows and like just bopping about the place. Like so yeah, I'm hopeful that with Taylor now on this card, and hopefully there is a bit of co-promotion from, like, it makes sense surely to have these two Irish people on the same card, to put them side by side, like both in the same weight class as well. Like there are lots of opportunities there, and as I was saying last week, like the last time, and Gavin, you sort of alluded to there, the last time that a lot of Irish fans, if ever they've seen Tennyson, was on the card at the TD Garden. I think it was back in 2018 when James Tennyson fought for a world title. It was on the same card as Katie fighting Cindy Serrano, and like since then Tennyson has gone on a brilliant run, but they've been on maybe smaller Sky cards or early on in big pay-per-view cards. Like this is going to have a lot of Irish eyes on this card this weekend, and yeah, it is a really good opportunity. And Straffon is a tough guy, but tailor-made for Tennyson. Like he's solid enough that he'll last a few rounds, so it doesn't look like a sort of pathetic fight, but he's static enough and he will get hit enough that Tennyson will get a stoppage, hopefully mid-rounds.
Events and opponents tailor-made in very different ways of interpreting that phrase. Just that he keeps those characteristics in reserve, Gav, actually reminds me a little bit of Andy Lee, who I think that Irish viewers might be seeing a little bit of on this card on Saturday night as well.
Yeah, Andy Lee is in the main event, but he hasn't come out of retirement, and I think he'll be as relieved as anybody to realise that. But he's training Joseph Parker, who is fighting Derek Chisora in a heavyweight fight, which is the headline event here on this box office show. And Andy has probably grown in stature at a remarkable pace as a trainer through his work with Tyson Fury, most notably. And I think even within that, through the fact that Tyson Fury looked like a different animal altogether in his rematch against Deontay Wilder, where he was aggressive, spiteful, and stopped Wilder as he said he would, and as Andy and Sugar Hill said he would. He also works with some prospects here. It's a bit unfair on Jason Quigley to call him a prospect. I think he's a little bit beyond that at this point, and he's got a big fight coming up. Paddy Donovan, who might be one of the top prospects in Irish boxing altogether, but this is, I guess, what is it? A bit of a departure in that it's a Kiwi with no real affiliation to Andy, or no real prior affiliation to Andy in Parker. Came with the recommendation from Tyson Fury. Both of them did, I think, both Parker and Lee. And it's going to be interesting to see how this goes from Andy Lee's point of view, actually, because the criticism of Parker throughout his career so far has been that at times he's not aggressive enough. He can be a little bit passive, and it tends to cost him in big fights. Against Derek Chisora, you're going to be fighting against an aggressive type of fighter, and I would say that Joseph Parker is a better boxer than Derek Chisora. So if Andy can add a string to his bow in which he becomes more aggressive and becomes more spiteful himself, more calculated, this could be a signature win of Parker's career, really, and a real rebirth of his career as a heavyweight contender. So there's a good bit on the line for Andy here, and if Parker wins impressively, Andy's stock will continue to rise.
Okay, let's go back to Katie against Natasha Jonas. Joe, how am I gonna make some money out of this?
There's actually, and I hate the word value, but there is good value in this fight. That Taylor is 9-2 on for the win, which is, I think, crazy odds, because that's pretty much what she was for the second Pursoon fight after we knew how dangerous Pursoon was. Like, normally Taylor's fights she's been prohibitively short. So there's that. I'm not a value bettor myself. There is the stoppage again. You're probably lurching into value here because it is 4-1, which is quite long, I think. But yeah, like, not to sound depressing, but like, the bookies know what they're doing, and Taylor being 13-8 on to win by points is like, that sounds about right to me.
Gav, your prediction?
Yeah, Taylor points, I think, is the sensible bet. I think it's reasonably good value, to use that word again. I guess if you've a spare tenner lying around the place, 4-1 for a stoppage is pretty decent, because, as Joe outlined earlier in the fight, there are question marks around Jonas' ability to sustain a kind of a 10-round challenge against a fighter of Taylor's caliber when we have seen her crumble before. But points bet would be my gun-to-head prediction.
Yeah, well, Sky Sports Box Office Saturday night is where you can watch Katie Taylor against Natasha Jonas. Joe, thanks so much for joining us. Do stay with us, because Joe is about to morph into David Sneyd, and myself and Gavin David will be looking ahead to Manchester United against Liverpool right after this short interlude.
Now, Gav and I have swapped roles, and we're going to chat about football. Manchester United versus Liverpool in the English Premier League. We're joined to do so by freelance journalist extraordinaire David Sneyd. David, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks for that nice little extraordinary part of that introduction. Thank you.
What are the hype levels like, David, on your behalf for this game this weekend, particularly in light of some of the absolutely putrid football we witnessed in the weekend just gone?
It's strange in the sense that you would expect Liverpool United. Normally it's a game that you're either very, very excited for or sick to the absolute pit of your stomach, depending on what's at stake. And at this point of the season, it kind of just, I don't know, just maybe it's just because it's coming towards the end of a season that has just feels as if I wish it would end, especially in the bracket of all the Super League stuff. It actually feels a bit pointless what happens on the pitch. It's actually what I would say was I'd actually be more interested to see what happens off it, and whether or not there's demonstrations, and whether or not we get a sense of Liverpool fans and maybe Man United fans actually coming together for a common good and making a statement off the pitch. I think that personally that would be of far more significance to anything that happens on the pitch, just because of what's happened over the last week to 10 days and the kind of impact that it's had on a lot of people's attitudes towards the supposed Big Six in English football.
Still a pretty significant game on the pitch, Gav, for Liverpool particularly, you'd suggest. I mean, is it more important for them this weekend than it is for United at this point of the season?
Yeah, probably. I mean, United will finish second. The league could be decided this weekend if City win on Saturday and then Liverpool win this game on Sunday. They'll actually be giving up the crown that they spent 30 years trying to win up until last season. So it's probably bigger for Liverpool on the pitch because United will finish second, and the Europa League, the semi-final against Roma, is probably a bigger game in their season now at this point. But even still, like, I mean, Liverpool have to win if they have any hope of finishing the top 4, really. But they're 4 points behind Chelsea now. They're 8 points off Leicester. So, like, I mean, they're not going to catch Leicester at this point. I'd be pretty surprised if they catch Chelsea either, because Chelsea are a better team than them and are much more energetic and are in much better form. So probably means more for Liverpool, but even that isn't saying a whole lot. I think this is like David, my hype levels unfortunately are pretty low, and if the sun is shining on Sunday, it's actually giving me a hard argument to sit in and watch the whole thing.
But
I don't even know why. Sorry, Dave.
No, sorry for cutting across you, Gav. No, I was just saying, like, I know there's probably a lot of Super League fatigue now at this point, but like, the owners of both of these clubs have shown their hand now to both of their managers, and they do not care about the Champions League. So from Liverpool's point of view, like, if it's important because it's worth £100 million or whatever it might be to actually qualify in terms of what they do next season or during the summer. Obviously, that's going to be important, but like, the owners have shown that actually they don't care now about the Champions League. And so, like, if you're Jurgen Klopp, or if you're all like Gunnar Solskjaer going into this, like, how I don't know, the absolute lack of respect that they've both been shown by their employers. Like, they've shown their hand. Like, it's not a game. Like, it's a game of pride if you're obviously Jurgen Klopp and if you're Ole Solskjaer for the players. But, like, do you reckon that John Henry will be sitting in that kind of hostage-like room? He gave that absolutely pathetic apology for him giving a rat's arse about this game. He could not care less. And he's shown
John
that.
Henry,
Malcolm Glazer, God rest him, he's not going to be turning in his grave if United got hockeyed 5-0 in this game. His sons aren't going to care. His daughter Darcy's not going to care. So like I don't understand. Like, I know I said this earlier about it, but like, I really hope that there's something happens outside the ground and that people get a real sense of the anger that is being felt. I know there's going to be a fans forum with United fans on Friday discussing this with the club, and like, it's been so frustrating and so disappointing because there did seem to be some kind of developments made there between fans at United and the fans forum with the owners and the people who run the club more so, and it's just been torn to shreds. And that's why this game now on Sunday, like, means, it genuinely don't think means that. Really doesn't. Not to the people who actually matter, and that's a lot of the fans now, because it just genuinely doesn't mean that.
David says, Gav, that the Champions League doesn't matter to these owners anymore. They've shown their hand, and yet with the collapse of the Super League as even a distant prospect at this point, or at least in the medium term, I'd imagine the Champions League is kind of important to them again, even though it wasn't this time last week, in the sense that as much as these lads can afford to lose a potential £100 million or so, that will likely influence budgets for next season and beyond. There are complications to not earning that money when you're trying to plan out from the point of view of Jurgen Klopp what you're trying to do over the next couple of seasons, particularly if Liverpool need a kind of a rebuild, as it seems they might.
Yeah, it's funny listening to David talk about that John Henry video. I thought it looked like it was filmed in a funeral. That was very much that kind of burnished wood vibe that I was getting. I don't think John Henry might be bothered about missing out on the prestige of the Champions League, but I think he will be worried about the bottom line. Like, Liverpool's accounts came out this week, they made an operating loss something like 40 million, and that's in a season with only 3 months interrupted by COVID, so there's worse still to come. So it's a bit of a disaster really for Liverpool to miss out in the Champions League, because they've spent big on wages and agents' fees and transfer fees, relatively speaking, in the last couple of years, but a lot of it was funded by player sales, and all of a sudden it's actually hard to see where they'll get that money in now if they don't have the Champions League, because, like, who do you sell? There's not the market there anymore. Like, I can imagine that Liverpool had built into their planning that we'll get 3 years out of Mohamed Salah and then sell him to Real Madrid for €100 million. Real Madrid aren't going to buy Salah for €100 million, and no one is, I don't think, really, because there's just more attractive options for people in the market, and that in terms of spending that amount of money, and the market's not there. So it's like, John Henry would miss out on the Champions League from a financial point of view is the main point I'm making, and like, that means they have to win this weekend, and even if they do win this weekend, I think maybe the damage was done in those games against Newcastle and Leeds in the last couple of weeks.
David, if we're not really interested in this game then this weekend, and rather than just switch off this Zoom and go back to what we were doing, let's continue to chat about football and I guess in a broader picture talk about, say, United season then. To what extent do you think Ole Gunnar Solskjaer has responded to his critics with whom he's been doing the tango over the last couple of years? As an overall body of work this season, how impressed have you been by what Solskjaer has been able to do at the helm there?
Yeah, well, first of all, the sad thing is I still actually bet into the game. That's actually the thing. So it's like so frustrating, but like it's a total hypocrite. But no, like I think it'll only be, again, it's obvious, but like you'll see what happens at the end of the season, and if United have won a trophy, if they've finished well second in the league, if they win the Europa League and finish second, then it's more progress that you've seen. Like if you look at it, it's actually interesting the fact that obviously it's around this game now against Liverpool, because the reverse fixture at Anfield, United were top of the table at that point, spent most of January top of the league. I think they were 2 or 3 points ahead of Man City after that Liverpool game at Anfield, and City had one game in hand, and since then like they just dropped, like they lost to Sheffield United, like they drew away to Arsenal. They seemed to get back on track at the end of Jan then with that win against Southampton, the 9-0. But then after that, then they just that draw at home to Everton and then West Brom back to back. That just really, from a point of during the season, since then they've just been second, but at that point you're kind of thinking, are the wheels going to fall off here? And to his credit, he has kept them in second place and as close to City, but well, the only team who are close, but still miles off the pace. That is a criticism of this season that will follow into next year if United do start well as well. They did get ahead, they did get top, and they just hadn't got it in them to stay there. Now, I think realistically, no United fan or no one looking at it would have expected United to be top of the league in January and to sustain a title challenge during the season. But when you're in that position and you don't do it, that's when there's going to be questions marks, and that's what will follow him into next season. Because if he goes into next season on the back of maybe not winning the trophy, that semi-final hoodoo again coming over him and finishing maybe second, or you never know, even third, if depending on what happens with, although it would be a bit of a surprise if they totally fell apart now at this stage. But like going into next year, that's going to be the big issue. Will be, can United sustain any kind of challenge? Because you would expect, depending on what happens with Chelsea, you would expect Chelsea to be a lot stronger next season. City will obviously be very strong. They're going to be the champions. They're going to be defending that title again. Could even be the European champions. Liverpool, you'd expect Liverpool to come back. This is the thing. Like, they're going to have a stronger squad next year with the injuries that they've had, getting players back. It's going to be a big test of Klopp as well, a little bit of can he not so much rebuild the team, but actually just kind of revitalise it a little bit. And wouldn't be surprised if they're like, I wouldn't be surprised if they come back a little bit strong. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they're going to benefit massively, I think, from maybe like Salah and Mane not playing any football during the summer. So that could be a major benefit. But from a point of view of from Solskjaer, it will, like, the next week is going to really could define a lot of the narrative, I suppose, around him. Is because if he doesn't win a trophy and they get knocked out of the Europa League, it's going to be major question marks around him going into next season. Especially, as I said, from a point of view of they got into a good position in January and just weren't able to maintain it.
Just before I bring Gav back in to follow up on that, Dave, Solskjaer seems insistent on making kind of more incremental progress with United. Like we've heard him only a couple of weeks ago almost dismiss the ideas of trophies being important, and I think you could take that with a grain of salt. He probably doesn't actually intrinsically believe that, but he was clearly trying to take the weight of expectation off of this squad, build more patiently, have a discussion maybe about trophies next season. Obviously they still have a chance of winning the Europa League as we speak, but then you look at Chelsea, to whom you allude there, and the fact that you would anticipate Chelsea will mount a title challenge of their own next season under Thomas Tuchel, and you see how quickly they have turned into a team who are now I mean, they're European contenders literally as we speak for the Champions League.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm asking in a long-winded way is, do you think that if United had a more established manager of Tuchel's ilk, that the patience or the progress wouldn't need to be so incremental, that somebody could transform that team with the resources they have at their disposal much faster than Solskjaer has, even if we accept that he's actually done a fine job.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Like that's one of the impressive things. Just like it's hard to say. Well, what would Tuchel do with this Man United team? Like he's done exceptionally well with Chelsea, and just turned them into a real, just look so organised and so just well regimented, you know, which is surprising for a German manager to be able to do that. But like it's just if you're looking at it from United's point of view, and what Solskjaer has done, like he's actually gotten a lot more. Obviously, he's made some good signings, like obviously Bruno Fernandes, fantastic, but bit by bit he's gotten so much more out of players who'd already been there and maybe looked as if they were on the way out. Like just what's happened with Luke Shaw? Obviously, isn't the majority of that benefit? The majority of that should be down to Luke Shaw. Like he's the one who's done it, but he's done it in a framework that Solskjaer has provided for him, and a management style that obviously has been well praised. Paul Pogba, he seems to have gotten a bit more consistency out of Paul Pogba, which you can't listen. Like you can't like sniff at that. That's really has been really impressive. And if again that's going to be another issue over the summer, what's going to happen with Pogba's future? Like the improvement even in Aaron Wan-Bissaka, like this year, like over the last few weeks, he's actually looked like a very competent footballer with the ball at his feet, which is again you have to give the benefit of doubt to the player. He's the one who's clearly putting the work in, but again it comes within a framework that the manager is providing. Like there's no doubt that the progress has been there bit by bit under Solskjaer. You see them now if you're looking at it just in the bare facts of on that league position, like they've already got more points at this stage last season than they accumulated in the whole of last year's 1 point more, around 67. Like they should finish second, like barring Man City having an absolute catastrophe now at this point of the season, and maybe like which isn't going to happen. You never know what's going to happen in a title race. Obviously, City have the league box off. Like I shouldn't have even mentioned that because that's just not going to happen. City will win the league, but I think sometimes, the progress is all right for it to be steady, especially where you look at where United have been coming from under that. Before that, with the change in the managers like Moyes, Van Gaal, Mourinho, just I think it maybe can be underestimated, just the depth of the feeling that had happened between the disconnect between Mourinho and the United fan base and that squad of players to when he took over, and it is just completely different now. The cynic in me, which has really kind of come to the fore, especially over the last week, would have made me think, well, the Glazers just want someone in there who the fans will tolerate and have a bit of a connection with, so long as they do deliver Champions League and that pot of money that comes every year. But like, I think bit by bit you have to start respecting what the job he's doing, and I also think, and this is no disrespect to Chelsea, but like compared to Man United and the actual kind of pressure that is there, it's like night and day really. And like the pressure you're under, maybe there's pressure obviously from Abramovich and all the rest of it, but in terms of media spotlight and everything that comes with it, like it's different, totally different league. And in terms of how Solskjaer has managed it, like look where United are in the league, and if you are gauging it in terms of progress of consistency, they've come on so much this season. As I mentioned, there was clearly that dip after January, few draws and that defeat to Sheffield United, but that's the last time they were beaten. And I think if he does get this trophy, which I think it'll be a big thing maybe for some people, if he does get that trophy, that will relieve a little bit of the pressure, but it's just going to ramp back up as soon as next season starts, and that's what he has to be ready for again, is actually sustaining a title challenge for next season, because that's going to be the next stage on this development. Because as you said, there's been incremental improvement. You would like to think that there'd be improvement in terms of recruitment during the summer, and then it's going to have to be a case of seeing just a title challenge effectively, and it looked to be happening up until January. It faded. I think that'll be accepted as a team in progress, but from next season that won't be accepted.
Looking at the man in the opposite dugout then, Gav, were you at any point over the last number of weeks of the belief that Jurgen Klopp might have been reaching the end of his tether, and indeed the end of his tenure at Anfield? And if I can ask you a second question, to what extent do you think Klopp needs to rebuild next season, or can he rely upon roughly the same personnel and kind of reinvigorate them rather than having to look externally?
I think if Klopp was to leave Liverpool at the end of this season, I think it'd be more likely that he would resign than be sacked. Like, I mean, like he's as safe in terms of from the sack. He's as safe as any manager in the Premier League, as I think. Whether he would resign, I thought maybe he might resign based on the stresses of this season, and then late in the last couple of weeks, I thought he might resign, having been tossed under a bus by his owners over the Super League. But seemingly, neither of that is the case, and he's going to at least see out his contract until, when does it end? 2022 or possibly 2024? Sorry, but he'll be around anyway for next season. Yeah, I thought, like, it does appear that the arse has fallen out of this thing now in a very serious way, and maybe it's somewhat understandable. Maybe it's a kind of a reversion to the mean, because if you look based on budgets, Liverpool should really be kind of the fourth best team in England. Like City, Chelsea and United all have more power, more financial power than them, and they were just so exceptional in the previous 2 seasons, to the point where they overperformed a little bit, and were extremely fortunate with injuries. But all of that is given away this season. So I thought, up to, like, how much of this season can be explained away by the injuries, the Van Dijk one being the most obvious one, and the kind of cosmic bad luck at centre back. But in the last few weeks, you're beginning to think that this is a kind of a broken system, and I think the team needs a reboot next season. It needs fresh blood, but I also think it needs to change some of its ideas, and I think that's a very interesting question that's going to be asked of Klopp now, where he hasn't really had to do this before. You know, previously his team got dismantled because Bayern Munich bought their players. Whereas now, like, I mean, like, is anyone going to come in and cherry pick Liverpool's big players in this market? I don't think so. So it's difficult for him to say, thanks very much, guys, you've been great for me, but you're finished now, farewell. And there are players in that team. I think he has to have that conversation with, like, Roberto Firmino's been like the pivot. Everything has worked around him, but he's been in decline for 2 years. You know, he looks absolutely shot, and understandable. Like, he's been ran into the ground up front in that team for years. And it looks like Wijnaldum will leave because they can't agree a contract extension with him. So he'd be a big loss, actually, because, you know, he was an integral part of the team that Klopp built, with Henderson and Fabinho in midfield that went and won the big trophies that they had to win. So it's a very interesting to see how he rebuilds, and will he be given a budget to rebuild? I mean, the fact that they were signing Ozan Kabak on the last day of the January window on a loan suggests that maybe that money isn't there. But I do think they have to invest. So it needs serious revitalisation. I think a break, and obviously the likes of Van Dijk and Gomez coming back from injury will do wonders. But I think it needs fresh blood, particularly up front, possibly in midfield as well. So it's that's going to be a very interesting question asked of Klopp that I don't think has been asked of him so far in his career.
I think we probably all need a break, do we? Not from you guys, mind you. But David, ahead of this one then, which way are you leaning? Do you anticipate United will pretty much definitively put an end to Liverpool's bid to reach Champions League football, or do you anticipate it being another absolutely mawky stalemate? They're not usually as bad at Old Trafford, is the only thing. It's Anfield for some reason. I think United tend to be more conservative there. Liverpool probably a little bit braver at Old Trafford. Which way do you think it'll go?
I don't know, I suppose a lot depends on what happens in the United Roma game on Thursday, in terms of what's on the line. Like, if United go and have a great result on Thursday, they're going to go into that game full of confidence, and if they've put the tie to bed, which it's very rare you would do that in the first leg of a semi-final, and especially the first leg is at Old Trafford. Like, you can struggle. Like, I don't know. I don't think you can ever really be too confident of United winning at home, just because of how they have kind of maybe stuttered in a lot of games. But then, if you actually look at the record, they've still won a lot of games at home. I think because so much does depend on this for Liverpool, I think they could be about 8 points behind, 7 or 8 points. I think they could be 8 points behind Chelsea by the time of kick-off, because of, like, Chelsea are at home. Chelsea have Fulham on Saturday. But I just think there's so much riding on the game from Liverpool's point of view, that they have to just leave. They can't leave anything out there. They have to, like, really kind of go at them. And you would think that's going to play into United's hands. Like, United can almost set up maybe one of the benefits of no fans, that he can actually set up like an away game and let Liverpool come onto them and hit them on the break. So I think United will win. I think it'll probably be by the odd goal. I think, as you said, I think it could actually be a decent game. It could be a bit end to end, and I'm going back to what I said earlier. It's just, part of me is just because of everything that's happened over the last while, I just wish both teams could lose 5-0.
At least we'd see some goals, Gav. Which way do you think it'll go yourself?
I think Manchester United will win, Gav. I'm looking at William Hill. A match handicap, Man United -1 is 9-2. So that's what I'm taking ahead of this game, and for exactly the reasons that David has outlined. Liverpool will have to attack, and they have some of the slowest centre halves I've ever seen in the Premier League, and United have some of the fastest attackers. So I think they'll rip them to shreds on the counter.
Unanimous decision. David Sneyd, thanks a million.
No bother. Take care.
Gav, Cooney, thank you very much.
Thanks, lads.
Thank you to everybody at home for watching or listening. Thank you to William Hill. Remember to visit dunlewy.net and gamble responsibly. Until next time, mind yourselves. Take it easy.